I be crying if I look like that too, bro. That's fucked up what they be doing to y'all. I ain't even gonna hold you, bro. I be saying that's fucked up, like, bro. You probably had the full washing set. Your shit be fire probably if they ain't cut your shit. Fuck it though, bro. It's your life.
I'ma show y'all how much y'all bitches be out of pocket and drone. Like, this shit gotta stop. It's never gonna end. Look what she did to my man's shit, though. She cut my man's shit up. Then she cut my man boot up. Not the Yattas. Not the Yattas. She did fuck you, bitch, on the Yattas. She out of pocket. Got my man clothes out and shit. All low shit, Dita shit. Got my man. Yo, she out of pocket. She chopped shoes. She put dead ants in a napkin. Bitches is devious. She said cheater on his butters. Ah! Ah, she put cheaters on her butter. Ah!
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Indieheads Retrospect. I am your host, Matty, aka @Prince on Twitter. On this episode of Retrospect, we have Jackson.
Hello, it's @horse_jeans on twitter.com. It's time. We're at one of the real big boys of this series, and I'm very excited for this episode. Hello.
We also got Jake in the house.
Yes, hello. You can just call me Matty too.
And we have the return of one of the podcast OGs,
Yes.
Nick.
Hello, everyone. I'm Nick. It's been, I don't know, probably about 4 years, I'd say, since I was last on a podcast for this. So I'm really excited to be back talking about an amazing album. Glad to be here.
Very, very long time indeed.
Almost as long as since this album came out. It's 5 years
it's true.
now.
Yeah.
Wow.
Frank Ocean dropping Blonde. That's when, again, that was a cataclysmic event for Nick. He disappeared.
It may or not have been a coincidence. I'm not going to say anything.
And now that COVID-19 has delayed everything, he's free to come out, knowing that any Frank Ocean album delays are not his fault at this point.
I also think it's really funny that like the wait between Channel Orange and Blonde was very famously 4 years, and that whole time we were like, where's the album? And like the 5 years that have transpired since Blonde feel like 1,000 years compared to that amount of time. So like,
yeah.
I mean, one of the great things for Frank Ocean about this album was after this album came out, everyone, even the most ridiculous Frank Ocean fans, were like, "Okay, I guess we just have to give this guy time."
But also, I mean, he dropped like a ton of singles.
He started feeding us after Blonde. Now that he's independent and can drop whatever he wants whenever he wants it, and
he's like, I'll spoil him now.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very unrelated topic we might get to toward the end. I am so excited for whatever that next. Obviously, I'm excited for the next Frank Ocean album. But the moment that story dropped, where he's like, "Yeah, my next album is inspired by like Detroit club culture and Chicago house music," I'm like, "What the fuck, Frank Ocean? Who gave you the keys to my brain? What are you doing in my dreams? Get out!"
At this point, he just can do whatever he wants, and it literally does not matter. Like he doesn't need to do anything anymore. Like he's
living the dream. And along with his great album Blonde today, we're definitely going to talk a little bit about like the context of the release of this album, because the way he put this album out and the way he set up the release of this album and the way this album is receptive is all kind of like linked together. You can't really talk about Blonde and Endless without talking about like the build up to it and the release of it and all the expectations and the way that this album shattered a lot of those expectations. But I think one of the I've been listening to both albums a lot lately to prep for this album, and one of the genius things I think about Blonde is that it's a lot more unconventional and experimental than I think we even realize as like fans of it, or even maybe realize at the moment, partly because he knew there was so much expectation building up to the release of this album. He's like, I need to release an entire other album to throw them off the scent, to like get rid of their expectations. And so he released Endless, which is this album that is simultaneously designed to be underappreciated because it's being buried in this Apple Music video that is just a way for this album to satisfy his contract and get out of his record label, but also like he Endless is an album that's very intentionally obtuse and like mysterious and very atmospheric and kind of like just sort of washes over you. And the genius of that was that after Endless, like all of our years of expectations just kind of go out the door, and we're like, okay, I don't fucking know what this thing is going to be. And then when Blonde hit 3 days later, it just sort of washed over all of us, and we just sort of accepted it as it is, even though it is like, in going back, it is a real radical departure from Channel Orange before it, and all the changes that he makes, not only to the sound. I mean, there's no drums, basically, is the big change, besides a couple of tracks and a couple key moments, but it's also the way he writes is so different than on Channel Orange, and it's just such a seismic shift. And I think the way that he, to start this conversation off, the way that he set that up with the whole rollout and the fake out and the two albums being released at the same time really kind of geniusly off put us for then Blonde to come in and just hit us all collectively as a society like a truck and ruin our lives emotionally for a summer.
See, doing this podcast it's tough preparing because at some point, it's like I have so many memories attached to this album and the time that it came out, but also at the same time, like all I want to do is just say pain, period, just to like most of this album. That because
Yeah.
that's
Only
all you
pain.
can do sometimes. Only pain. That's
every song on this album, either you could write like a 10-page like dissertation on it, or you could just say ouchie, and like equal would be appropriate as criticism.
A 10-page dissertation that just says ouchie for 10 pages.
Exactly. Do we want to talk a little bit, as a little quick detour, about Endless and its relation to Blonde and how we feel about Endless? Because I really, I mean, like, though obviously with the whole music video thing, it was intentionally kind of designed to be the album of the two that's more obscured and whatever. But I think it, one, makes a really incredible companion to Blonde, and also I think is equally, it's only not discussed in the same kind of critical appreciation as Blonde, really because of the accessibility to it. Like, for a long time you had to have a rip of it, and because the tracks flowed together so much, and because the track listing was like unclear for a while, and like when you used to have to listen to it on rips of the music video where people would divide up the tracks like incorrectly, so you would think one half of a song was part of this track in the track list, but actually that track starts at this point and all that sort of stuff. So for a while, like, it'd be hard to talk about Endless because you couldn't just be like, remember that song? That song's perfect. Like, it exists as this kind of amorphous other thing. But over the years, as once I had listened to Blonde like 10,000 times and was like, this is the perfect album and the best album ever. But what if I dabble back into that Endless stuff and started listening to it? And then eventually we got the CDQ and the vinyl release, which I own, and it is beautiful, almost more beautiful than the Blonde record with all the shiny shit on it. It's so cool. But I'm glad. I think Endless has gotten a little more appreciation, though, as people have gotten their hands on that CDQ, and as he also performed a lot of the Endless songs live when he briefly left his home and did a couple of shows that I got to see one of. And especially now in the light of coronavirus, the fact that I've seen Frank Ocean live, like that very likely could have been a once in a lifetime chance, and I very likely may never see him live again. So I'm really glad I got that in while I could, because who knows?
yeah. I mean, I do expect Frank to, I mean, especially now, just to continue to be like such a recluse. I consider him in some ways to be like a mix of like Scott Walker and Fiona Apple that way, and being just
Oh
sort of
yeah,
a recluse and rarely touring. And I mean, well, Scott Walker just straight up did not tour for like most of his late career. He just did not tour. Basically basically toward the end of like Climate of Hunter, he didn't tour.
Was so happy that Coachella got canceled because of coronavirus. He was
Oh
like,
yeah,
thank God, thank God, I don't have to actually play that shit.
It's
A
like,
sigh
ah,
of
shit.
relief swept over
Probably
him.
back in like March, he was like, ah, shit, I gotta play in like October now. Like, fuck. And then now seeing like how things are going, it's like, okay, cool. So I just get to stay home. Great,
Yeah,
awesome, amazing.
he's probably
But
making so much music right now.
I would hope. But
I
like, yeah,
see.
the thing with Endless, I don't have many thoughts because it's an album that still I have a hard time like wrapping my head around it. Still, it's still such a like Blonde is like is a monolith. Like it's
Yeah,
one of the big monolith albums we're gonna be talking about for this retrospect. It's just so hard to figure out how to tackle it at times. But Endless is even harder to tackle. It's like it's not as much of a monolith as Blonde, but it's still just like such a mysterious thing. It's like Blonde is like a really big Easter Island head, and Endless is like a smaller Easter Island head, but like has more like weird carvings on it. And you're just like, what the fuck is
and
this?
like it seems to be changing every time you look at it. Like,
Yeah. I was really late to getting on the Endless train for whatever reason it was. I think it might have a lot to do with my listening habits and,
I
kind
think
of
it's the
being
accessibility.
yeah.
It's just because it's only on like basically there's two versions. It's like the endless music video, and then there's the vinyl CDQ rip that came
Yeah.
out with the release a couple of years ago, but it's still not on streaming services. It was supposed to be on streaming services, and then Frank's like, no, just kidding, it's not going on there, and then just nothing ever happened.
Yeah. I mean, like many of us, my I go to streaming services most often when listening to music. I have some other ways of getting music, but I try not to. I mean, I just stick mainly with streaming because it's easiest. So I kind of delayed my listening of it, but right, I really appreciate that Frank even would release something like that because I think that we're going to end up talking a lot about how personal these two albums are, especially I
mhm.
mean, definitely Blonde because of, obviously like the lyrical contents and the themes and everything. But Endless really to me is cool because I think a lot of people realize that he was making the tracks for both of these albums probably at the same time. I don't have like a source on that or anything, but
I actually think, weirdly enough, I'm pretty sure. I don't know exactly what stage of completion, but like Blonde was written entirely and like sitting in the can in some form before he started writing most of the stuff with Endless. Endless is like what he started doing once he had quote unquote finished Blonde and it wasn't going to be released anytime soon because of all the stuff with his record label.
okay,
So
gotcha.
I think chronologically, like most of it comes afterward. Which is then is also kind of interesting because then his strategy of releasing him is like, all right, I've taken this one huge leap forward from Channel Orange to Blonde, and in the time that I've been trying to get Blonde out, I've taken this other leap forward further into obscurity and experimental stuff. And he's like, I'm gonna give people the stuff that they're like really not ready for yet as like an amuse bouche to get them ready
Yeah.
for like the next transition from Channel Orange to something that's like a little more recognizable and a little more traditional in its songwriting.
Yeah,
But yeah,
I mean, like the fact that they came out at the same time too, like we were talking about, is kind of like the same thing. Like, I think like it's just like that. It's not really as like focused as Blonde in a way, but it's definitely like a really great collection of tracks. Um,
yeah,
and I think that I wouldn't want to call them like Lucy's because I don't think that's really fair. But I mean, some people probably would describe the album that way, just because it's. I mean, it's all over the place, but like in a good way, in my opinion. And I
Hmm.
really can like appreciate him releasing that in the first place because probably, I mean, like since a lot of the songs are really short, they might not have been as like fleshed out as he wanted them to be. He might have wanted to work on some of them a little bit more. But the fact that an artist would release a really big collection like that, I think is really admirable. And it kind of reminds me that like a lot of, for every like album that one of your favorite artists put out, there could be like a dozen other, I mean, even more than that, tracks that they're working on at the same time that you might never hear about.
And Endless is the thing that makes it, I think, really great, is that like it's so well considered in the way it's constructed, in the way that all the ideas flow into each other, so that like even though it is very scattered and kind of loose and hard to grasp as like an artistic complete statement, like every track in it, like they flow so well together into each other, and a lot of tracks have these like transitions and interludes and stuff that really makes it feel like, even though it's simultaneously like so hard to grasp, you're also like, this isn't just, it's not just like, there's a lot of intentionality to it that makes it like really really worthwhile to keep revisiting and keep probing at, in a way that Blonde is too. Like I was thinking, when I was listening to this a lot, I was thinking a lot about Kaput Cast, which was a great piece of podcasting content that I loved very much. But Frank's music is similar to Destroyer in that it is similarly enigmatic, and there's similarly this kind of quality where it's speaking to something, but it's kind of difficult as a critic to sort of place what it is. But I think the difference is that there's like this emotional immediacy to Frank Ocean's music, where like as Destroyer, you're kind of on the outside of it looking in and trying to like parse what's going on in here, while Frank Ocean's music kind of envelops you in that mystery and in that kind of unknowable quality. And I think when you're talking about the personal nature of these albums, I think it's really, really, really fascinating, because on one hand, Blonde is the most personal Frank Ocean album, and is so much more personal than Channel Orange, which is an album of like stories about characters that are meant to be like kind of analogs for things he's experiencing or emotions that he's having, but they're like clearly distanced from him. And on this album, he's operating in this gray zone where clearly he's speaking about his own life and his experiences and his emotions, but he's doing it in a way where he's also saying like, this is not exact, like it's the Beatles thing he interprets, or the Elliott Smith thing, I mean, this is not my life, this is just a fond farewell to a friend. It's like, this isn't, this piece of art isn't exactly like autobiography. It's not straight from my life experiences to the canvas, but it's me turning my life experiences into this other thing that exists in this gray area between the listener and the author, and your memories and his memories. And it's just, I'm going to try to not ramble for this whole episode, but it's going to be really hard, because this piece of art is like, to Barry Jenkins' voice, foundational. Like, this is so important to, I think, the music of the 2010s and the way that artists these days now think about albums and writing and producing. Like, it's so influential and so important, and I'm so excited that, one, that I get to talk about it because I wasn't a part of the podcast when you guys reviewed Blonde originally, but also that we get to talk about it with like some time to think about it and let it gestate, because this is a really, really important album. IMO.
There are like, I don't know, I feel like there's a lot of aspects to kind of music in the 2010s in general that either have already aged poorly or seem like they like will age poorly, but for whatever reason, like whatever Blonde was in 2016, I feel like we haven't even aged into it yet. Like I was listening to it today and yesterday and kind of all throughout this week, and I was like, wow, there's really no other album that like sounds like this, just like period. Yeah. But at the same time, it's also so evocative of kind of just like the music from the decade in general. It's really interesting how he's able to kind of like hit both of those sort of like contradictory things at once.
Yeah, it's like simultaneously like very in conversation with it, like thinking about like the beginning of Nikes, where he's like, there's a lot of like shouting out and making these like cultural references to like Pimp C and Trayvon Martin and that sort of stuff, and it's sort of, it feels very in conversation with what was going on at the time, but then it's also so alien and completely like from another world, where it, like I really think Fiona Apple's album this year is the only thing that's come around in the time since that reaches a similar level of like, this is so completely apart from the entire musical landscape that it came out of, and it's so singular of an artist's vision. And I think even though we haven't, as a musical society, we have not caught up to Frank Ocean yet, we may never catch up to Frank Ocean, but like, I think that he has really inspired sort of a kind of ambition of what an artist can be in the 2010s and the internet era, and combining all these different influences and molding them together into something that is so personal, even as it is drawing on all these different kinds of things and traditions.
I feel like in 40 years, this is going to be the album that I kind of like think of when I'm like
Yes.
reminiscing about this kind of time
Mm-hmm.
in my life. Like this is the album I think that's going to kind of like stand out.
I mean, I was just thinking about that before we started. You know, I was I think I was 16 years old when this album came out.
Oh
So
God.
then yeah, I was pretty young. And I mean, obviously I was listening to it from the minute it was out, and I don't think that there is another album that has come out. I mean, I can't there isn't one that stands out to me as much as one that I think that I will be talking about well into my life as an album that was very important to me when I was young and when I was kind of in some of my formative years and turning more like adult like. This is one of the albums that has stuck around for that the most out of anything I've been listening to over the past 5 or so years. And it's really important to me because of that. And I think that a lot of other people my age feel the same way. I liked what you were saying, Jackson, about or I think it was Jake actually, maybe how the album kind of hits on, kind of being kind of a pop sensation in a way, and kind of hitting two like kind of targets really hard, and the kind of, I don't know, like kind of the more
Yeah.
alternative side of R&B
No,
and hip hop, and also just reaching out directly to people that I don't really,
no,
you know what I'm saying, like the more
I,
pop
I,
side of it.
I get what you're saying with the pop, because this is like a really perfect pop album in that each one of these songs, even though they're very experimental in their approach, they work so immediately in the way that pop songs do, where you don't need to like think about them
Yeah,
or have an understanding of the kinds of musical things that are going on. They just like wash over you. Like, I think Ivy is like a really great example of like, that song is so simple in its musical construction. It's literally just two different guitar parts layered over each other. And this is I was especially like really focusing on the music this time around as I was trying to like prepare for this podcast, because I think the thing is, the first time you absorb this album, Frank's performances and lyrics and storytelling are so like transfixing that you don't even really notice like what's going on
yeah,
instrumentally on this album a lot of the time when you're listening to it, if you're not like specifically looking for that. Because when you listen to a song like Ivy, you're not like, oh, this guitar part is nice or this thing. You're just like completely transported to a place and to a memory. And I think that's why this album was able to be as incredibly huge as it was, and like widely popular, while also being very like, this album doesn't have a lot of the things that pop music has. Like, there's almost no rhythm on this album at all. Like, the drums that are here are incredibly sparse, and when they are, they're almost not on. They're on very few songs on the album, and when they're there, they're not really big and thundering. They're just there to add a little bit of extra kind of texture to the track, and it's really deconstructionist and minimal, but also like every single song, the couple of elements that are making up each song manage to feel so huge and like expansive. Like, the way he's able to just have one or two elements feel like this massive, open, huge, maximalist space is a magic trick that I still haven't deciphered 5 years later. Like, I don't know how this album works. I don't
yeah,
understand it. I fear its magic powers, and I have a deep respect for it.
It's like one of those weird optical illusions where it's like if you look directly at it, you're not getting what the actual image is. It kind of has to like exist around you. I think you pretty much nailed it on the head with what you're saying as far as it's like trickily minimalist, where it's like if you're just listening to it, it doesn't feel like it's that minimal, and it doesn't really feel like it's that sparse. But when you actually pay attention, you're like, wow, there's like really nothing on this song besides just like a guitar. There's like really nothing on this song besides like two or three elements, yet it's still able to be like as fully engaging as all of these other like maximalist, like huge like pop R&B albums that are like coming out.
I was gonna say, I think it's one of those, the thing with this album, like it took some time for this album to kind of reach me, because I know I listened to it a lot of times, and I was just like, I was kind of disappointed on my first couple of listens to this record. I was just like, wow, this record is I'm not sure how I'm feeling about it, but it but it had one listen where it clicked. It was a late night. I think I was in St. Louis for some reason, probably a concert or something, and I'm just driving down on the roads of St. Louis late at night, and that's when it just clicked. It's like, okay, the pieces have all come together, and you know, that's just what makes this album so wonderful. Is that, yeah, instrumentally it's a lot to take it compared to Channel Orange. It's very, very different, even compared to like the stuff I was, more the indie stuff I was listening to was very, very different. But once it clicks, it's just I mean, pain.
Yeah,
Pain, as we've established.
I think the instrumentation you were kind of talking about, Matty, compared to Channel Orange, kind of is like I think it kind of contrasts Frank's performances on this album as opposed to Channel Orange, where it kind of complimented them in like a straightforward way, but in Blonde, it's kind of, like based on how he's singing, you don't really. He's able to fit so many different types of instrumentals onto this album that
Mhm.
they all are like they're all accompanying his voice in a very different way on each track, which I really appreciate. Like he really fits everything into this album. It's pretty nuts.
Absolutely.
I-
And like it's so simple, but also there are so many ideas and changes, and like this album is it's constantly either existing in a state of like stillness where there's all this kind of ambience and just stuff washing over you, but then all of a sudden these songs will take these turns where all of a sudden like what is something very minimal will just like explode and expand outward. And he has a couple of secret weapons for that, mainly Johnny Greenwood string arrangements, which absolutely hit like a ton of bricks on this album. And but like I was just so like taken with like kind of like Jake was saying, like usually when you think of like a minimalist singer songwriter pop album, even something that's like kind of inspired by sort of ambient music and Brian Eno or whatever, you kind of think of like stripped down. You're imagining, usually it's the kind of thing where like on a Sufjan Stevens song where you're able to imagine someone in a studio recording this music. And besides for like a couple of specific moments on this album, like Good Guy is the one real only example of this.
oh
Like
yeah,
even though it's just Frank and just a little bit of instrumentation and it's so bare bones, not only does the instrumental completely fill the space in this beautiful way, but also like he is creating that much space in the instrumental for him to do all this stuff. Like on Solo, especially, Solo is just that song is literally just I think one instrument. I think it's just like the organ piano, and he is like weightless on that song. He's like singing and rapping, and like he just takes flight, and he's using that minimal palette that sort of acts as the foundation of the track just to then completely explore these stream of consciousness like journey to experience. I can't
there's
even.
James Blake on the keys.
Oh, that's James Blake on that song. Oh,
If I may be
let me
wrong, I have
I
to
have
look.
I have the liner notes in front of me.
It says keyboards track 5. Yep.
Arrangement Frank Ocean and James Blake. Keyboards James Blake and Mars 1500. Yes.
It's the boy. Yeah, we were talking about that a little bit before. How the production list and list of musicians on this
Oh yeah.
album is just massive. If you just do yourself a favor and go through it and look sometime, because I think it is just really interesting to see
And
like all these
it's
people
such
I
a
didn't even realize were on it until recently.
Yeah, it's such a great combination too of like Frank using his newfound fame that he has from Channel Orange to like pull in some of the biggest artists in the world to do very, very small contributions. Like Beyonce sings fucking backup vocals on this album, and it's one of the, but it's also perfect. Like it's such a great, great addition to Pink and White when her backup vocals come in, and like you've got on Skyline 2, you've got Kendrick Lamar, the current greatest rapper in the world at the moment this album was recorded, and he's like, "Hey Kendrick, can you come into the studio and just record yourself saying a couple of the lyrics in
Just
like
say
a
smoke.
smoke,
Peace.
trees, peace." And but then
Wait,
also,
wait, what?
you didn't know that was Kendrick?
No.
Dog, listen to Skyline.
You learn something new every single day.
I think basically all of us, maybe except for me, because I'm a crazy person about this album, but I think everyone in the process of preparing for this podcast learned something new about this album, because there's so
Oh
much
yeah.
into every song on here, in the samples and the interpolations and the different people contributing
I
music.
had or
Go ahead.
sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna mention that I basically had like a meltdown yesterday when I found out that the song "Close to You" is an interpolation of like the old "Close to You" song by the Carpenters, and I've like fully loved both songs for so long, and I just did not realize for whatever reason that they were the exact same like melody and like the same song. So
Yeah, that's one of my favorite. Close to You is one of those that has really, really, really grown over the years of listening to this. Like that, the thing is, I really loved it at the time. Like right from the moment like got this, I was into it. I was full steam ahead. But it's one of those albums where the songs I loved on the first kind of goes around are still some of my favorite songs ever, and the songs that are like, this one's just okay. Like over the years, I have built a galaxy brain case for each of them, where I'm like, actually, "Pretty Sweet" is kind of the best song on Blonde. Like every part of this, I have an equal amount of appreciation and admiration for. And "Close to You" is one of those that, especially once I saw it performed live, which when he performed "Close to You" live, he sort of introduced it by explaining that the inspiration of the song came from not the original Carpenter's version, but the Stevie Wonder cover of "Close to You" that he performed on the David Frost show in the 1970s, where he does the entire Carpenter's song through a vocoder keyboard. And it's, first of all, just go turn this podcast off and go YouTube that right now, because it's absolutely fucking unbelievable.
it's nuts.
I've watched it like 6 times this week. It's really great. But also then like when he does "Close to You" live, he performs it with the kind of same with he performs it like the way that the Stevie Wonder cover is arranged, and he performs the entire thing instead of just the minute and a half snippet that we get on the album. And it really, really hits different once you've kind of learned where it came from, and also seen the other version of it. But yeah, that's just one of those things, is like every one of these songs, like it's a mix of some of the most important musicians in history, like the Beatles and Elliott Smith and Stevie Wonder, and also like some of the most important musicians that were going to go on to affect the future of music, like Alex G and James Blake, and just even smaller no name people that no one had ever heard of before this album, like Vane, who's
What
Yeah,
did
got
Alex
Green.
G do on this album?
Alex G played a lot of the acoustic guitar. He does the acoustic guitar on Self Control and
It says he has guitars on White Ferrari.
White
Huh.
Ferrari too.
With the
Yeah,
list I'm looking at right now.
and for the live shows, Alex G was one of the live instrumentalists up on stage. He was playing the damn guitar strings, uh, which was his live show. I'm gonna try not to talk too much about it, because I could do a whole entire other podcast on that, the greatest concert I've ever seen. But that I think the live show, the main takeaway from it that I think is very, very relevant to Blonde, and the thing I was most impressed by the live show, is the fact that this album is this duality of intimacy and also like maximal like expression, and the live show was the perfect like embodiment of that. Because when I was going to it, I was like, I'm so fucking excited, but I was also like dubious because it's like, how is it, what is it gonna be like to see this album in concert? Because all these songs are so personal and so like it's so an album that you listen to alone when you're like driving or taking a walk. And well, basically it's an album for what we're all stuck in now. It's a perfect quarantine album, but like uh I was so apprehensive about that. But the thing about the live show is that he used this incredible use of video in the live show where he had goddamn Spike Jonze shooting the video for every festival he did. And he had this 100-foot like video screen on the main stage behind him, and then had his stage out in the middle of the crowd so that he was like surrounded by people. And it was this incredibly surreal thing where on one hand it's like it wasn't at all like the kind of grandiose like spectacle that you usually get from that kind of a headlining set where it's just one guy on stage with like a couple of session musicians like Alex G and Buddy Ross like sitting in chairs just playing their instruments, and there's no like bombacity to his performance. But like because they were using the video to capture like him performing in really really stunning detail, it was completely transfixing where you were just like locked into him performing these songs. And like the camera was so good and also so close to him, and like you could look up on the stage and not only see him playing his instrument but like count the individual rubies on the ring on his finger. Like it was just a completely surreal experience. And so like I was obviously very very moved by it. But I think that's something that this album gets at too, is that balance between it is so universal, like so many people have an intense relationship with this album, but it is also like so deeply personal to Frank. And everyone's personal relationship with this album is a little different because it's so much about our memories and our past. And so this album is just going to evoke different things from everyone because it's so much drawing on what it feels like to reminisce on a first love or on some of the experiences that he goes into on this album.
Yeah, I really kind of like that interpretation. It's to me, it's sort of like it's like a kaleidoscope where like each person like looks into it and sees something slightly different, and it kind of like inherently attaches itself to you in like these very personal ways. But I like what you're talking about with how it kind of sounds like a memory, or like there's a lot of sort of like reminiscing about the past. And I wrote this down a bunch when I was like taking notes yesterday. But there's so many songs in some that just like sound like how a memory sounds. Like that's obviously not really like an objective thing that you can capture, but like yeah, so much of this like feels like being in a dream, or feels like you're having like some sort of daydream about the past, which I think that like sort of atmosphere ties into a lot of the like themes surrounding these songs.
I was rereading before this podcast started. I was rereading some of Frank Ocean's Tumblr, as I do on like a yearly basis. I just read all 50 pages of Frank Ocean's Tumblr. But I also was reading the letter that he released with Blonde that was in the Boys Don't Cry magazine that he also posted to Tumblr. And there's a quote from the end of it where he's specifically talking about Godspeed here, but I think this really gets to like the core of what this album's relationship to like memory is. He says, I wrote a story in the middle. It's called Godspeed. It's basically a reimagined part of my boyhood. Boys do cry, but I don't think I shed a tear for a good chunk of my teenage years. It's surprisingly my favorite part of life so far. Surprising to me because the current phase is what I was asking for the cosmos for when I was a kid. Maybe that part had its rough stretches too, but in my rearview mirror, it's getting small enough to convince myself it was all good. And really, though, it's still all good. And first of all, fuck, goddamn it, Frank Ocean's one of the best writers to ever live. Second of all, I think that really just hammers home this like idea of the fact that these memories that he's looking back on are for the most part like pretty painful, but they're wrapped in this kind of nostalgia that time and distance creates for the past.
Yeah.
And the way that as you get further from that memory, as he's saying, your perception on it sort of narrows, and you're only able to imagine it as just kind of, you're only able to really conjure the good parts and these beautiful things you're able to take out of them. And I think that is runs through basically every song on this album. It's very foundational to what this album is all about.
I think that that's sort of like, to me at least, kind of like the spore inside this album, like things that being simultaneously much simpler but also like much more complicated in the past. And I think this album kind of gets to the heart of that idea, which is that like nostalgia is sort of like dangerous and bad because you kind of end up like romanticizing a version of the past that like doesn't necessarily exist like in reality. And I think this album sort of like nails that dichotomy like over and over again, like looking at like this relationship from when he was a kid and being like, man, that whole situation was awful, while at the same time being like, man, I sure like do miss the past. And I think that those two things are like sort of not that compatible, but it's like also such a real and complicated emotion that he somehow is able to just kind of like nail over and over again.
Yeah, it's like the thing where everyone like has some sort of, on very different levels, weird fondness from high school, even though high school was like probably objectively the worst part of my life. And if you gave me the choice to repeat high school, I'd be like, no. But also when I
Yeah.
hear something that reminds me of high school, you get the warm, weird tinglies just because like that's just the way our minds kind of work. And I think he's something he's really in touch with throughout this album.
There's this AV Club Jeff Rosenstock interview on YouTube that's like 4 minutes, and they basically just have him like rate various things on the Pitchfork 1 to 10 scale. And one of the things they have him rate is nostalgia, and he says, "Nostalgia is great. How else can you be sad about being alive currently while remembering your past inaccurately?"
Oh.
Ow.
Yeah.
Pain.
Pain.
I promised myself I wasn't gonna be the first one to say the word duality when talking about this album.
Congrats!
I was just waiting for it.
I knew we were getting to it eventually. We might as well.
No, yeah.
In the room.
I actually like kind of going that way. It made me think of something. We were kind of getting to this talking about just like the composition before. But you know, there is a really big, you know, kind of like two-sided or duality theme to this album, whether it's like lyrically and the content of the songs. You know, like compositionally, the beat switch on Nights occurs half an hour through the album, and it's an hour long, I think, right?
Oh yeah. I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, Nights is this. It literally is the exact
center,
midpoint of the album.
And it kind of like something I was thinking about that kind of, you know, it probably isn't intentional, but just makes me think of just kind of a balance between, you know, Frank's performance, which is really just like is magical and really larger than life and kind of draws you in, as opposed to really some of the like instrumentation on some of the songs, which can be kind of sparse, but also just feels really like, I don't know how to say it, but like organic to me. It kind of like in contrast to Frank's performance, which is really, you know, sounds like he's singing to you from like the fucking moon or something. But like, something I noticed when I was re-listening to this is that I think you can hear a clicker at the beginning of Siegfried on the guitar, or like somebody's metronome going, and that kind of just like reminded me, I guess, of how small or just how like kind of put together the instrumentation is, that it's just kind of like small parts going together. And I really can appreciate that. We were talking a little bit earlier about Buddy Ross. That's his name, right? The keyboardist. Yeah. Buddy Ross. I was reading an interview with him earlier today, talking about just kind of like the process for him working with Frank and kind of doing some stuff for this album, because he does have the keyboard interlude that plays on what are the
it plays on
Future of Free,
and then the end of Future of Free, it comes back for
but it was kind of interesting to me that he was talking about kind of just what the process is like for recording parts for this album, and that he would just like Frank would kind of like tell him some stuff like what to do, and he would usually be like alone, like it wasn't really like a session going on with a lot of musicians, and you know, like Frank would tell him like, do this, I kind of like that. I wouldn't like do a bunch of takes for it or anything, would kind of just like take what he got from him and move on. And I think that it's really interesting that, you know, like we're talking a little bit about how big the list of musicians on this is, but really, like, I don't think it was, you know, like, it kind of made me think of My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, where like Kanye flew a bunch of people out to like Hawaii, and they had like a giant studio and we're just like going between rooms and recording stuff. But to me, what it sounds like Frank did with Blonde here is kind of just like bring a bunch of musicians in that he respected a lot to do different parts, kind of like one at a time or maybe like a few at a time, and then take their parts and kind of put them all together in the sequence that he wanted to. Because I think Buddy Ross said that he didn't even really know like what his parts were going to be for, and he didn't really know until he listened to the album, which I think is really interesting. That's kind of the process that he went to go through for it.
There was someone else who was in an interview basically saying that like every part it's like a director who's like, I'm not going to give you the script, but I just need you to
Yeah,
do this one thing, and I think that's what makes it so it's a lot like the Kanye comparison is really apt because that album is a collection of like all of these titanic figures in music, but they're all executing Kanye's vision, and this is a different version of that where Frank is collaborating with all these different people, but he's taking those collaborations and then taking all of them into like a dark sealed room where then he assembles them into
yeah,
something completely different that is completely out of his vision and his creation. And that's what allows like all of these different details and things to coexist so like naturally, where you've got like production from Pharrell and Beyonce is on here and Andre 3000's on here, but it doesn't feel like star-studded or overwhelmed. It's just so singularly all Frank's vision. And if you don't really go in and look to see what all the individual components are or who played them, and you could just go your entire life without realizing, because they just act as like Matty was saying, these like monoliths of songwriting that are just so distinctly Frank.
I mean
yes,
that's kind of the crazy thing with this album is it has, again, like I said, it has all these collaborators, and yet like you don't feel there's no ego, at least to the collaborators on this album. Like you have fucking Beyonce doing backup vocals, and it's just like she doesn't try to steal the show. She's just like adding. It's just how good of an artist that Frank is, and how much people believe in his vision that they're willing just like, whatever you need me to do, Frank, I'm here to do that. Like I don't, if it's just backup vocals, if it's just me saying, just doing like random ad libs, just like whatever. I believe in your vision. How can I help you
yeah,
achieve it?
One thing that I also think is interesting that sort of plays into what you guys are saying, just as far as like the structure of the album goes, is that a lot of the songs on this album have sort of weird structures. Like for songs, when you think about it, like there's some like verse, chorus, verse stuff, but like a lot of the songs are like kind of two sections that just kind of get like sewn together, or like just three kind of like individual but like sort of different verses, and they kind of all get like woven together in this like different like tapestry of ideas basically.
oh yeah, definitely. I
um,
think that's why it's like it makes it even more amazing to me how like wide reaching this album is and how many people can really appreciate it, because I mean it's not conventional really at all. You know, like White Ferrari I think is one of the songs that gets talked about the most for this album, I'd say. I mean, maybe not as much as like Nights
yeah.
and like Self Control, but it's definitely up there. And just kind of like the way it's structured, and the ending, which I think is just gorgeous too. It's just very like soft, and it's really great that, you know, like an emotional track like that can get a lot of respect that it deserves.
It's very nearing on 100 million plays on Spotify, which is just nuts. Like
Man.
that
Yeah,
song is like we were saying earlier, it's deceptively experimental and unconventional, because there are weird dramatic shifts going on, and like sometimes a song will be entirely centered around one instrument, and it will just like there will be a keyboard melody that's like the main basis of the instrumental, and then all of a sudden it's just like now it's an acoustic guitar all of a sudden. But like every single one of those shifts is so perfectly executed, and the seams are so carefully like put together that you never feel those dramatic shifts unless you're like active, unless you're listening to the music like trying to decipher it on a critical level. Like if you just put this album on, it doesn't it just takes you along with it. So like when they do these real big moves like the beat switch in Knights or the part in Siegfried where it opens up and the strings come in, like you don't even comprehend what's happening musically. You're just in the zone. You're
The
taken
drum
by
and
it.
bass drop, pretty sweet drum and
Oh my
bass.
god. Yeah, Pretty Sweet
God
is
damn.
he that when he did the live show, he opened with Pretty Sweet just playing on the stereos as he walked out on stage, and I was like,
Oh.
oh, okay, this is the fucking best right here. And the thing I love about Pretty Sweet is not only the sick drum and bass stuff, but also those choir vocal samples. It's like one of my favorite bits of sampled music on the album. They're so good, and the
Like
way
the very ending.
yeah,
Yeah.
Pretty Sweet is like the nightmare to the rest of the song's like dream qualities.
oh absolutely, yeah.
It's pretty abrasive, but like it in like a good way, in my opinion. You go
Yeah.
ahead, Matty.
It's a real test of will in the listener. If you, as a listener, be like, "Oh, I hate Pretty Sweet. I don't trust you as a person." It's like, no, no,
Yeah.
no, 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 no. Like you gotta. It's abrasive for a reason. It's obviously just like that instant like hit of the guitar and the strings, just like what the fuck is going on. You feel like you're entering a nightmare zone. It's like you're watching Vertigo and one of those like crazy sequences. And of course, it brings us like this beautiful chorus and all this. I think one of the magical things about this album is how he's able to turn these very like traditional instruments, like these just instruments that we're so familiar with, that we've heard so many different ways they're being used, like the guitar, and make them sound completely otherworldly. Like on Siegfried, the way the guitars sound like satellites. That's like the best way I can describe it.
Yeah,
It's just like
100%.
it's insane how the way that how what he's able to do with the sounds on this album, where he's able to take these traditional things, just like they don't.
It's
There's no albums that sound like this.
he's making simple things complex and also making really complex things super simple at the same time. And I mean, I'm going to try to not make all my comparisons like there are two wolves duality comparisons. Like, that really is a lot of what this album is going on. Like, I mean, and that's obviously something like Frank is invested in. Like, that one of the key elements of his quote unquote coming out letter, which really isn't a coming out letter in the sense that people received it as, is the whole kind of thesis of that letter was, I'm not telling you I am Frank Ocean, I am bisexual. I'm going to tell you. He spends the letter describing an experience of in his life when he first fell in love with a man and how that forced him to reckon with the things inside of him. But as he said in like a GQ interview, I think he's like, I didn't give you a label. I didn't give you a box to put me in because I just got out of one box. Why would I want you to put me into another one? And I think so much of this album is about him simultaneously opening himself up to the public it seemed like he was running away from, but also shrouding it in this layer of mystery where you simultaneously feel like you know more about him than you did before, but you have like a million questions that you're never going to get the answers to. And I think that is so impressive, to be able to shroud something in a shred and that kind of mystery without just seeming like you're being intentionally obtuse or pretentious.
I was just gonna say, I think that like that sort of enigma to both this album and to kind of like Frank Ocean's image also kind of like plays in, for me at least, to how the album sounds. Because like personally, it's like I have like listened to Channel Orange and Endless like a good deal, but I'd say that like a solid like 90% of my Frank Ocean listening time has been dedicated to Blonde. And like the fact that he's like such this enigmatic figure, and the fact that it pairs so well with like the weird like mysterious ethereal qualities of the album, I don't know, it just kind of makes sense that he's like that, and it sort of, I guess, helps to mold like the image that Blonde takes up in my brain.
Definitely. Do we want to? I just realized we are nearly an hour into this podcast and we haven't started breaking down this album like in a track list type way.
I think it's a little weird to break this down. It's like obviously
That,
all the tracks on here so well, but at the same time, it's an album that obviously all the tracks are great, but at the same time, it's just sometimes better to just talk about it as a whole and how it makes
no,
you feel because
absolutely.
it's such a
I'm glad
larger piece.
we got so much out of the kind of big picture discussion of this album, but I also do think we should drill a little bit
Yes.
into some of our
Oh yeah,
favorite moments and lyrics and things on this album because
Oh yeah.
I'm going to stay it for the end, but I do want to talk about the interludes a little bit because I think
well, the interludes are very
oh, they're
important.
great.
Like I was talking about with Pretty Sweet and Good Guy, like the interludes are also like they're a little not so much a test, but like so many people were just like, oh, it's very silly or whatever, and like some of it is just Frank being silly. Like I think Facebook Story is the least. I mean, but even Facebook Story is
Oh, I need to
deceptively.
talk about Facebook Story at some
There's
point.
a
Oh
lot
no.
there's a lot going on with Facebook Story and its inclusion on the album and like what he means. But I think the one that really has aged the not even the best or the worst, but just the most is every time I listen to Be Yourself now, I remember the first time I listened to Be Yourself and I was like, oh, what a funny thing that he included this little voicemail from his friend's mom, and now I cry almost every time I listen to Be Yourself.
Whoa.
It's so like it's really, really emotional for I mean, I not for some reason. I know why it's emotional for me. It's because I smoke too much weed.
Yeah.
But because like the thing about that that's so interesting is that it's simultaneously like this really chastising monologue where that he immediately contradicts with Solo. Like the joke people made is that he has the entire minute and a half of don't do drugs, don't do alcohol, don't do weed, and then the very next song he's talking about like taking tabs of acid and smoking good, rolling solo, and like he's contradicting, but it's also about like the be yourself. It's also about the genuine sentiment of the voicemail and the idea that the mom is like, don't try to be someone you're not, don't try to act like someone else. And it's really emotionally resonant even as it's kind of being mocked by Frank in its inclusion and the kind of self-seriousness of it. But she's also right, like you probably shouldn't do drugs. Like
Yeah, I mean, if my
it's
mom
not.
caught me saying shit like that, then I would stop smoking. I mean,
Yeah,
I mean, it's heavy. Like, it's. I don't know. I don't know
definitely.
what that guy's reaction was to his mom when she called, but she's she's pretty mad.
Yeah, she's
She's pretty
flipping
heated.
out.
Yeah, I think the interludes are super important. They kind of don't get talked about as much. I think especially when the album just dropped. I think that a lot of the attention. I mean, I wouldn't expect the attention to go to the interludes mainly on an album like ever, but
Yeah,
I think that as we've gotten time to listen to the album more, we've kind of been able to put the interludes in kind of the context of the album thematically. And
absolutely.
I think that Facebook Story is like really like I think the first time I heard it, I probably laughed because of his accent.
It is really
Like I'll
like
be honest,
doing
like
an impression of the Facebook story guy is a great bit that we've all received from this album, and every single one of us has done the accept me on Facebook.
and I
Like
was right in front of her.
it's a
He's
great bit,
fucking nice out.
but it is. You're right. It has a lot of meaning and
Yeah, and
significance.
especially to me personally, like I really I think a lot about just social media in general and how it's I mean subconsciously and actively every day it's affecting us a lot, and it's kind of heavy for me because I like to think that I don't really like the way that social media affects me in general. I think I've kind of been conditioned in some ways through social media that I react to things in ways that if I didn't spend as much time on it, I probably would be different in that way. But I really try really hard. I mean, last year I was at, I mean, really around this time, I guess last year I was at a pretty bad point, just in my personal life, and I kind of was looking at social media like, what am I really getting out of this? Like, do I need it? Do I really enjoy it at all? And I kind of put together like a list of the plus sides and the downsides of what I got out of it, and ultimately I decided to kind of throw it away for like a few months, when I was saying it,
Yeah.
I was like, I'm gonna do it permanently. Like, I don't want to get back on this stuff. Like, I need to do other things that are gonna make me feel better about myself. But yeah, eventually I caved in and I got back on like Twitter and stuff. But like for a pretty good amount of time, I was completely off social media, and I think that it was a good thing for me. But I really could not tell you now, like, if it made me like a happier person or like made me feel worse about myself because I wasn't on there as much. But yeah, I don't know. Social media is just big, and I think about it a lot, and I think that I feel bad for that guy, and that's good. That's all I'm gonna say.
I think that kind of like extending it to like social media at large is like I agree. I think that this interlude is sort of going to be an interesting artifact of the 2010s. Like when
Yeah,
people look back on it in like a couple of decades, because it's sort of like I feel like people. I mean, not that recently, but like sort of lately, have been sort of kind of starting to have this reckoning with social media. Like, is this actually a good thing?
I
Like, is
think
this affecting
quarantine
my
is definitely.
relationships?
Yeah, I think quarantine has
Yeah.
definitely contributed to it.
Everyone's
Or
everyone's brains have gotten like 17% worse on social media and in quarantine.
Oh yeah.
well, yeah, and there's this whole like, to use the word like duality of like how people are on social media versus like how people are in
Yeah,
reality, and like it's that exact kind of like clashing that I think he's like talking about on this Facebook story. He's like,
yeah,
well, I'm right here, like why do you need me to add
Mm.
you on Facebook? It's like it's
And
just
I
really interesting.
I think going back to what you're saying is it being like a cultural document. I think it's so specifically located with this person who was there at the time at which Facebook was implemented, and how it's at this exact moment in time in history where there are some people who are now growing up with it and are growing up like conditioned to it and conditioned to that as being normal, and other people that are seeing it as this completely alien thing. And the disconnect between someone who's like, this thing is important, this thing has meaning, versus I'm apprehensive of this thing
yeah.
because like, in the future we're going to get to a point where no one knew what life was like before social media, and this is kind of this exact midpoint where these two people are being pulled apart as a result of it.
That guy was woke originally about Facebook. Like
Yeah,
he
really
still doesn't have it. He still
If,
doesn't have it.
if you're gonna make the social network too, don't do it on the fucking Senate hearings that Mark Zuckerberg did. Do it on Facebook story. That
yeah
that's
we
that's that's the social
I,
network
I,
too.
I would really love a Aaron Sorkin, David Fincher film of just this guy breaking up with his girlfriend because you won't accept her on Facebook.
Oh
Facebook.
man.
I'm
I have
imagining
a
I'm imagining a walk and talk, a Sorkin walk and talk with just two people with this guy's accent. She wouldn't accept me on Facebook.
Oh,
Oh
great,
God. Okay.
great
uh,
stuff.
but I but I think the thing with the interludes in this album, I think if there's one thing with this album that became very influential, is that it did bring people back into like wanting to do interludes again on their album, mostly for worse. I think you're gonna hate me for it, Jackson, but I think an album that basically got hit the worst in a post Blonde world was that last Blood Orange record, which I
I
think
I I,
which
I
I
don't
think
I
tried to do
don't
the interlude stuff and it just
I
did
don't
not come together at
disagree.
all.
I think in general with that kind of thing, it's tricky because a really really well placed interlude and a track list can be so huge and so important, and like the albums where it works, it's so important to how the album works. But like so off like the Psychopomp interlude is the platonic example of this. It's just perfect. It's perfect where it's placed in the track listing. It's perfect in how it leads you from one moment to the next in the album and gives you a respite from that album's barrage of fuck me up emotions. But like I think so often people use that kind of like they take the influence from Blonde and they try to use it to attach all of this additional like meaning and weight and thematic importance onto the songs between them. And when it's executed poorly, it can, like you're saying, like I like that Blood Orange album a fair amount, but the last
Which
one
one are
was
we
not
talking about? Sorry, are we talking
I
about
think Negro Swan, I think is what Maddie was
Negro? Are we
referring to.
talking about Negro Swan, Maddie,
Yeah.
or
Yeah,
Angel's
yeah, yeah.
Pulse?
Negro Swan. Yeah, Negro Swan.
Oh, okay, yeah, that's what I thought too because I thought that had more just kind of random interludes and stuff on it. But
It had the one like spoken word poet who was like sampled throughout as like
Oh yeah.
While I think a lot of those interludes were like very, very good poetry or whatever, that's such a more clear example of like, here is what Blood Orange is trying to say with this album and is using the words of this other person, where all the Frank Ocean interludes are they're much more enigmatic in the way that at first glance they seem like these just tossed in, like, oh, I got this funny voice, my friend got this funny voicemail from his mom, let me throw this on the album. But like they're considered in the way that they impact the story, but then
Yeah.
they also feel ham-fisted in the way that they're trying to do that.
I think he was really they're all kind of just like they're very like candid, I guess is the right word for it.
Yeah.
On
They don't
Blonde
feel
and
they don't feel planned. It's just like this is stuff that came about
yeah.
while the album's being made, and just cosmically they just sort of tied into the themes that he was talking about.
Yeah.
Whereas compared to like some other albums that do these interlude stuff, it's just like sometimes it works, but it is like, okay, like this isn't like a cosmic set of circumstances that led you to putting these interludes on the album. This is just like you just like, okay,
They're
like I want to do
intentional. Like they're
it's
intentional
too,
and like planned, I
yeah,
guess.
which I think can work, and sometimes it can work, but other times it's just like with Blonde, it's just so specific, but also like the that keyboard thing, that loop is
Oh yeah.
just it's so calming. It's
Buddy Ross, baby.
Buddy
it,
Ross,
Hollow
it,
baby.
Squad,
it
baby.
it has an effect that like a lot of the instrumentals on this have, where it really it feels like it never has a start or an end point. It's like constantly in some middle cycle of just like repeating itself, where like where the very best ambient music is like this, where it just kind of unfolds and you immediately get lost in the like soup of it, and it makes such a perfect little background for those skits and adds a particular emotional quality then that's contrasted really well. Like I especially love when it comes back in the very end for Future of Free
Yeah.
end album skit, where they're asking the questions like the what's your first memory, what superpower did you want to have growing up, and like you're saying, like the sincerity of them is really palpable and real, because like I believe the way that Facebook story specifically was recorded, I believe it was like that. I think the guy that speaks in French at first, by the way, the first time I heard this album, I knew Young Lean was credited, and I thought Young Lean
No, come on.
no, but Young Lean's vocals are briefly sampled on Godspeed, but
Yeah.
but he was one of the producers, or maybe just a friend of someone's, but basically Frank recorded like a whole hour-long conversation with that guy, and that topic of conversation just came up at some point, and so its inclusion in the album, the kind of unintentional candid feel is genuinely created, because it's like he wasn't saying to his friend, "Oh, I need you to be the skit on my album. Let me record you saying this monologue about Facebook." It was like a genuine emotional conversation and discussion about this thing that is related to some of the stuff that's going on in the album, but wasn't like, I'm sure the guy didn't know he was going to end up on the album when he was telling that story. And that's a quality you can weirdly tell not knowing the backstory of what's going on in it.
It's a cosmic sense of coincidences that lead to this album. It's just it's a monolith. It's a fucking monolith. It's the fucking giant thing in 2001: A Space Odyssey that appears out of nowhere. It was like, what the fuck is this?
And everybody's just looking at it like, what? Like,
exactly.
how did that happen?
I mean, because when this album dropped, it was a moment. It was just like everyone stopped what they were doing and put this album on. It was just, we had waited 4 years for this.
Does everyone remember where they were the first time?
Ooh.
I went for a drive and put it on. I remember what I did. That was a good choice.
I was never caught up like in the hype machine. I never listened to the first time I listened to Blonde was the October after it came out in August, and I'd never listened to any Frank Ocean before that, so I never really was like affected by the hype or anything like that. But I was listening to it on a cross country bus ride.
Me
I remember
too.
it was like the
way.
sunset. That is really coincidental. But it was like the sun was setting and Pink and White was on, and I was like, holy shit.
Yeah, I had like a moment, like I think I probably first started listening to it on the Friday it came out. Well, did it? I don't know if it came out on a Friday or not, but I know it came out around the first like memory I have listening to this album is on a cross country bus going to a meet, like head falling
Nice.
asleep against the window, school bus stuff.
Yeah.
It was good. That's funny.
Good cross country bus ride core.
Oh yes, definitely.
Were we gonna speak about some of the tracks on this album before? That's the thing with this album is that so much of this album is it's not only just speaking about the album itself, but just sort of your own personal experiences that happened at the time of this album when it came out. It's
Yeah.
for me when I talk about this album, it's not about the music itself and it's like what was the time in my life that this was in. This was the late summer, early fall of 2016. Just in that period of time before everyone's brain got completely fucking broken
Yeah, this is
by the
right
presidential
before
election.
brain crisis sweeps America, and we all become gremlins.
I was kind of this isn't really like a track by track thing, but it kind of ties into this theme of like where you were in your life when you were listening to it. Is that when I was first starting to get into like Tyler the Creator, and like also at the same time as him I was getting into Frank. It was probably around a year before Blonde came out, and I was mainly listening to like Channel Orange and Wolf a lot, and Doris, and I kind of envied people that were like a little bit older than me, that like were getting into like Odd Future, like when they were like a big group, like because they kind of were like just a sensation and just a big internet rap thing, which I like just really respected, and they were kind of going on their own paths by the time I was getting into them. But it's been really, I mean, we a lot of people talk about just kind of how much they've been able to grow and mature in their music, since they kind of left each other as a group. But I think that, the kind of core of like, I don't know, people would probably say like Blonde, Flower Boy, and like I Don't Like Shit. Those are all kind of like formative albums for me, I think.
Yeah.
Just definitely were really big for me when I was growing up. And I think it's kind of cool that there's kind of like, they kind of like were making music in waves where there's people before me that, were growing up with Odd Future when they were together. And now I'm kind of getting to watch them grow as musicians and go off on their own. I think it's really cool.
Yeah. Even though I'm not as into Brockhampton as I was when they first started
Yeah.
dropping and I started getting excited about them or whatever, it was really, really exciting to see like the first crop of kids who clearly grew up like idolizing Odd Future and Tyler and Frank and Earl, and like taking what they did and like running with it and doing their own thing, even if Brockhampton can be a little derivative at times. Like, it is very exciting to see, and I think it is so wild that like you were saying, that they were all in this group together, because not only have they all blossomed into such important artists individually, but also each of their paths and where they are now is like so divorced from where they started out from. Like, Tyler has completely done a 180, where instead of yelling slurs and being angry all the time, he's making these very sensitive like R&B soul type stuff. And then Earl has completely abandoned like the kind of rap music the kind of limitations on rap music that he was working within early on in his career, and he's started creating these new like different surrealist, like some rap songs is just such a departure from like the early Earl stuff, and is, in my opinion, the best stuff he's ever done. And like, I it's really impressive how much all of them have completely blossomed. And then you have
Yeah.
Frank, which is like to a completely other degree, where out of, I mean, like, I really love Nostalgia Ultra too, but like the just enormous jump in like scale and ambition, and Nostalgia Ultra and Channel Orange, even though they were unique, you could clearly pinpoint where they were within like musical legacies, and you can say, okay, I see how he's inspired by this artist, and I see how he's using this genre or changing this genre. And then you get to Blonde, and it's just like, this is just it comes from another planet. Like, it's just completely fully formed and fully realized in a way that is just breathtaking to witness and really exciting to get to. I wasn't on the very, very earliest wave of Odd Future, but pretty close to it, and kind of getting to see that crest, even though now Odd Future is not a, for the most part, like a lot of our time and effort was wasted in following Odd Future. Like I spent too much of my life knowing who Haji Beats was and caring who Haji Beats was, and that was time I could have invested caring about more talented artists. But like really the three gems we got out of it with Tyler and Earl and Frank, and even though I don't love Tyler's music as much, like is just, I think it's very special, and it's very interesting how they all kind of came out of that.
I think if we
All
were
right.
gonna go track by track a little bit by now, I would
And
want to.
I think we can be a little
Or
briefer than we normally
yeah, yeah,
would,
yeah.
as we've
Not,
sort
not,
of dug into a lot of, but yeah, we definitely should just go through the track list just as so we can kind of hit on whatever things that we haven't touched on already. And I think, I mean, Nike's is it's one of the, even though Nike's, when I first heard the single, it is like Endless. I think it's very intentionally disorienting. Like the having the very first song and the first single release that we hear from this album. First of all, if you guys remember, I don't know, but the music video that was released right in between uh, the drop of Endless and the drop of Blonde, the Nike's music video, in the original version of Nike's, not only did it have the pitch shift vocals, but it also had a second vocal track that's like really low. And he's talking about the first rule about the party is you don't talk about the party or whatever. And it was like
special shout
so,
out.
it's so disorienting and so intentionally like disarming, where it's like you're going in expecting one kind of thing and it's just completely not that. But then also the more you listen to this album, it's just like, well, Nike's wasn't all what I was expecting, but now that I've listened to it 1,000 times, I can't imagine another way for this album to start, because
Yeah.
it's just, it's got this kind of intoxicating, like almost drunken stupor to it that starts it out, but then it perfectly transitions into the second half of it, which is basically like after he kind of sets the stage and disarms your expectations, all of a sudden, like the mist clears, and all of a sudden you just hear Frank's vocals and just this really sparse instrumentation, and you basically get what you're going to get for the rest of the album, which is just Frank floating in space, floating in outer space, unfolding these personal monologues that are simultaneously very clever and very tongue-in-cheek, but are also very emotional and personal. And the fact that this album, the end of this very first track on the album ends with those lyrics like, he's got a roommate, he'll hear what we do, it's only awkward if you're fucking him too. Like you just know you're in for some shit the rest of the way. After you get that, it's just like it completely hits you over the head and perfectly kind of just sets you in the right space that you need to be for the rest of this album.
I really like that imagery that you brought up of when his non pitch shifted vocals come in for the first time. It's like him coming out of the fog. Like that is truly like what it actually feels like.
Yeah, that's accurate. Can we talk about Skyline 2, maybe?
Oh, buddy.
Yeah.
Before we do though, I feel like Nike's. I think Nike's is the beginning of basically with this album. You go back and forth between like two emojis. You go back and forth from like the nervous emojis, like the big ass eyes. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then you go to the crying eyes emoji, the bottom emoji as it's nicknamed. You go
Those
back
like
and
the
forth
two
between
like
those
most
two.
common. I feel like those are the two most commonly used emojis like across the
Oh yeah,
entire internet,
oh
probably.
yeah, those are my most used emojis for sure. If I
Definitely, they're
look
definitely the ones I use the most too.
yeah. But nevertheless, yeah, Skyline 2, but underrated. It's a song I feel like I see the least amount of discussion on, besides some of the other.
It is the greatest song of all time.
Yeah,
I'll
and that
I'll be the first to say it.
it's just so it's really really like I don't know, his performance I think is so good on this track and does not get the attention it deserves. It's very just very smooth the first part, and then it just kind of all when it all comes together and he's all the harmonies at the end. It's just really really great. And is that actually Kendrick on the
That is Kendrick doing the ad libs freely.
Yeah. Awesome.
It's like this is probably like the dreamiest song. I mean, I feel like you could use that adjective for kind of like so many songs and just kind of generally moments on the album. But that little like that little like synth line that I'm talking about, like halfway through the song,
Yeah.
Mhm.
that's the shit. Yeah.
I also really like
I-
how the drums are really. There's actually like programmed drums on this track, I think, but they're very like. They're
Oh
very
yeah, I know. I
minimal.
noticed that today too when I was listening to this. Like, there
It's
are
kind of
drums in this
wholesome.
album, but you wouldn't even notice them if you weren't like listening. Are there drums on this? Like, they're really really subtle, and
Yeah.
like we were talking about earlier. Like, part of the reason why this album is so hard to talk about in terms of its individual components, because much like the thing he said about memory, it's like when you look back on this album while not listening to it, it's much like a dream where you can't really, or a memory where you can't really make out the individual components. You're just like, I feel this cloud of emotion over there and I know what that cloud is, but only when you're inside of it can you really like start to break it down and analyze the parts. But then even going back to, it's just like, it's like a dream where you wake up and it's like, when I was in it, I had this clarity of what I was seeing, but now that I'm looking back on it, it's like this complete mirage.
I was gonna say, I mean, this song especially. I mean, obviously, it's like a dream, and I think this song again, one of many lines that just like as soon as you hear it, it's just imprinted on your brain, and it's just becomes such a cultural moment. I mean, like that's a pretty fucking fast year flew by.
Yeah,
Like that's
Yeah.
that's a line that sticks with you for
It gets
forever.
stuck in my
that
head.
that, that one in "Summer's Not as Long as It Used to Be." Every day counts like crazy. Uh,
Hmm.
those, I mean, there's a bunch of lines about time on this album, but this one especially is the one I think that deals with the passage of time in the most interesting ways, perhaps. And lyrically, this is also a really, really great highlight of the album.
I
Hmm.
just want to touch on something Jackson mentioned like a minute ago is with the like the sort of dreamlike quality where you can't really like fully comprehend the experience like unless you're inside the experience. And I feel like Frank brings up like psychedelics a few times on this album, like doing like mushrooms and stuff, and I feel like that is sort of like a similar like time dilation type of experience where it's like when you're outside of it, you can't really like comprehend what was happening on the inside of it. Um, and I feel like that kind of extends inside and outside this album.
Totally. I mean, as we talked about briefly before the podcast, in that letter that he wrote about the release of Blonde, he talks about an experience of getting too high at the trip day at Caltech and having to have his manager come pick him up and being driven in a car across the city. Uh, and yeah, this album does have that kind of surreal sort of quality to it, but also uh, that feels like a drug trip or a dream, but also like a kind of hazy memory. And I man, I we should really get into the next song the album comes after Skyline 2, because we've talked, I think, a couple about the first couple of tracks really well. Self Control is just, I mean, you could say, we're going to say this 5 more times this episode, but this is the best song ever made. This is the song of the year that year, the song of the life. It's uh,
I think.
absolutely fucking
Shout out
iconic.
to Josh. I love smoking mid real quick.
Oh god. Go Hubie.
Oh God. Okay, but yeah, self control. It was funny
One.
because I was posting in the little blonde chat we had for this podcast. I was just posting pain. Period. Every single and both like again the 2 or 3 times I did it, the guess was self control, and it was not self control, but still, pain.
Pain.
Yeah, big time pain. I mean, you talked about like there are so many quotable lyrics that have stuck in my mind in the years since this album has come out, that like bounce around my head like pinballs every once in a while. And Self Control might be some of the real heaviest hitters, like wish I was there, wish we'd grown up on the same advice and our time was right. Like that one just sticks like a knife in my brain forever. And also I Came to Visit Because You See Me Like a
Yes.
UFO. That one is
Yes.
one of my all-time personal favorites. It's just like individual lines on here that contain so much meaning, and he's able to, like, the thing I love so much about his Tumblr and his writing and his songs and just his qualities as a writer in general, like he's able to convey such uh such complex emotions with such clarity and simplicity, and not to make a pun, but frankness. It's just kind of like
Yeah.
he just says it as it is in a way where you're like, I can't believe I haven't had that exact thought in that way before, but now that I've heard it, it's like that's how I'm going to describe that.
Yeah.
Like you were
When you're
saying,
getting seen like a UFO, like you know when you feel
yeah,
like a UFO and it hurts. I
I
don't
think you
want
were
to be like
saying in the
that.
chat before we recorded this that like you can just say to someone, "I am feeling Self Control" by Frank Ocean, and people know exactly what emotion you're talking about, and that's a valid
Yeah.
way to describe your feelings.
Also
The
known as
"I know you gotta leave" like at the end
Oh
over and
yeah,
over again
absolutely.
just
That's
like obliterates.
it's the most
I don't know.
like one of the most transcendent moments on the album, and like I was talking about, like this album is so minimal and pared back that you would think that something this big would be like a disruption to that, but it escalates so naturally that like by the time you get to the outro and all of a sudden this like incredible like rush of really big instrumentation and the layers and the way that the vocals are layered, the I know you gotta leave, 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 and like the stacks of layers on top of his voice, it's just it's so enormous, but it unfolds so like naturally and subtly that you just kind of get taken away by it like you are a UFO floating away. It's really fucking beautiful and one of my favorite songs ever written, easily.
Cosign.
yes.
But yeah, so many lyrics on here that just fucking hurts. It just
Yeah.
hurts, And then obviously just the opening line of poolside combo. Just
God, you're
it,
so
the thing with this album is that it every I think the reason why I haven't listened to it so often lately is just like, do I want to be transported back to the time where I listened to this album? Sometimes, yeah. Sometimes, no. Absolutely
oh
not.
yeah.
And as soon as that
Mhm.
poolside combo, you're just instantly transported back to who you were in 2016, and just you know, obviously, just the way that this song opens, it's just sort of like the tape kind of rewinding a little bit. That
Oh yeah.
effect. Just
Yeah.
oh god. There's so many subtle things in the sound design of this album that just like add so much to it, and just
Yeah.
instantly put you in a space, like
Going off of that, like one of my favorite production details on this song and on the album in general is the way that the pitched vocals are used on this song, and then the way that he uses the pitched vocals for the first part of it, and then when that section of the song comes back around again, he doubles the pitched vocals with I believe it's Austin. It's the guy from Slow Hollows.
Feinstein?
Is Yeah, Austin Feinstein, his like really kind of mid-range like vocal, and then the way that those two vocals are like layered on top of each other is just like so dynamic, and there's so much like little stuff in this album that's doing so much, but like when you're listening to it, you're often not able to perceive all those little sound design details and things because they all blend together into such a whole picture. All right, we
And
should
the
we should talk about.
"Keep a Place for Me," like "I'll Sleep Between You." That's
Oh
what
God,
that's what Young Lean is, right? Like that's
no, it's the young lean. No,
That's
he
Frank's
shows up in
music
the
that's
second.
switched up.
He shows up on the second chorus is when Young Lean pops in.
no. Young Lean's contribution on this album is on Godspeed. I don't think he's on self. I can look
No,
and
he is on self control. I'm reading I'm on the Genius page right now.
Yeah, it says different. It says different stuff depending on where you're looking on. Like,
I,
I think on
the
that
one place
vinyl
I
and on the Wikipedia it says that Young Lean is only on Godspeed, but on Genius it
yeah,
does say.
I mean the only place I the part of the album that I 100% know is Young Lean is the sample on Godspeed toward the beginning, where like very subtly, like between lines, there's this kind of cycling sample of Young Lean saying something like "ball so hard does something." That's Young Lean, But I don't know where else he might be on the album. I thought that was the only part. But I mean that kind of it contributes like we were talking about with Endless, but to even though we have all the credits of this album, there's also a certain quality to there's so much detail put into this album and so many things that were contributed and left out. Like I remember Frank saying that there's like I think actually I think it was Frank's younger brother who said on Twitter like there are 52 different versions of White Ferrari, and I don't the one he released wasn't my favorite or whatever. Like there was so much tinkering that went on with this album and different things that were contributed in a way that like even though we kind of do know everything about the album at this point and he's been pretty thorough in the credits and the different whatever, it still has this kind of mystical quality whereas like Young Lean could be on Self Control. Maybe he was playing an instrument, I don't know, like you never know.
I think one song, if we want to, we gotta talk. We talked about it a little bit, but Nights
Yeah,
is an important song.
the Self Control Good Guy Knights trilogy of songs right in the smack dab middle. First of all, is like being beaten with a sledgehammer emotionally, but like secondly is really I think is like the crown jewel of the album and kind of like obviously Self Control and Nights were two of the biggest songs from the album, but Nights especially is really one of the great like achievements of this album because this song is essentially three songs in one that are stitched together in some Frankenstein mad scientist experiment with a beat drop to connect them, and it's just magic. It's so good. The second half of Nights is like one of the best Frank Ocean songs ever, and the first half of Nights is also one of the best Frank Ocean songs ever. Like it's all just so well put together, and also because the whole album is so minimal up to this point, the kind of increased bells and whistles that are going on because he strips back so much of the drums and so much of the kind of stuff that we sort of expect in an album like this. When he does use drums and synthesizers and bring those things back in, you really feel their impact more because they were lacking in the other songs. And I think Nights is really where that hits the hardest.
Yeah, I mean, the first half is just sort of this sort of celebratory thing, and then sort of the switch is
Yeah.
But by the way, best beat switch since like maybe House of Balloons / Glass Table Girls.
It's really one of the it almost like Knights kind of it killed the beat switch in a way, I feel like, because
Oh
there
yeah.
beat switching and the beat changing up became such a big part of like music in the 2010s where like that became sort of a way like Drake did it so much where it'd be like, oh, this song is gonna all of a sudden we're gonna switch it up, and sometimes that works really well, like when it's done right, like fucking Sicko Mode is the one of the few good versions of this where like even though these parts are totally disparate, you've managed to stitch them together in a way that makes sense. But then so often after this album there were people trying to replicate that feeling and being unsuccessful and having it be like we're saying like ham-fisted and kind of uh trying to create that. But the way that the guitar solo leads into the like alarm clock going off and then the beat drop is just perfect, chef's kiss. Can't do any better than that. And it kind of killed the trend in a way because it's just like, okay, well, we're not no one's gonna do better than this, so you can either try to do a completely different thing, but like this specific kind of move became harder to do after this because of how much this fucking nails it.
I mean, yeah, as we've mentioned space. I mean, at least I've mentioned space a lot with this album. But I mean, the beat switch, it sounds like a fucking like a space shuttle falling down from the atmosphere. Just the way
Mm-hmm.
that it builds, and then the beep beep beep, just like it's just sort of it's like your life. It's like it sounds like your life flashing in front of your very eyes, like right before you're about to die, or at least you think you're about to die. Just going back to your past and all these painful memories. It's just that this way this album, like nostalgia obviously is a big part of Frank Ocean's music, and I think he plays with it so interestingly, just obviously lyrically, but also the way he's able to so sonically embody nostalgia in such an interesting way where he's able to make things sound like the past. Like I never went through what Frank Ocean did, but you know you're in a dream, you're in the world, and you're through his perspective, you're seeing all these things happen to him. I mean, have I ever been to a Shoney's? No, but when he says that when we can only eat Shoney's on occasion, I feel that. I mean, shit.
Nights is this weird like infinity loop symbol where it's like every night fucks every day up, like this whole like day and night like dichotomy, and then you got like the like kind of sunny first half, and then the kind of like dark and ethereal second half, and then the lyrics are kind of like uh they're kind of like a collage of all these like memories and like you're saying nostalgia and stuff. They're all kind of like tied together by like this theme of nights. And yeah, I don't know. It's the crown jewel of music, basically.
Yeah, just
It,
amazing.
it really is like you were talking about, Matty. Like going back to your kind of space metaphors, like the first half of it is like a spaceship like trying to leave the atmosphere, and then like the moment that beat switch kicks in, it's like all of a sudden like your feet leave the ground and there's no gravity and you're like sideways, and that every night fucks every day up line hits and you're just like completely like transported as we it's and I really love I love his vocal performance on the second half of this song, and
Me too.
doing like something he's continued to explore more post Blonde and in Endless, where he's blurring the line between rapping and singing in this way that is just so compelling, that it feels very inspired by like Young Thug and people like that, but is also so distinctly like Frank in the way that he does it.
I think my favorite moment on that song is definitely at the end when the chorus or whatever you want to call it comes back in
Yeah, yeah,
from the
yeah, yeah.
first part of the song, and he's singing it in like such a different way from like the first part, and with all the harmony on it. I think it's really just great. I think that's a really like it's really like when we were talking about beat switches, it's really interesting when I mean, I think a lot of beat switches probably do this anyways, but when the like both parts of the song kind of have something that ties it together, but they're still distinctly different at the same time. I definitely get that from Nights, especially lyrically too, which is just it's really good that he was able to do that and bring that part of the song back at the end. It's definitely one of my favorites.
Hell yeah, definitely.
um we talked about a little bit the Johnny Greenwood strings, but of course Siegfried, which whenever I did my song of the year list in 2016, this was the one Blonde song that I chose. It would probably be different now, but I still stand by this being one of the best on the album. And
My weird thing was Siegfried probably wouldn't have been in my top three at the time, and revisiting it now after putting the album down for a bit, I was like, is Siegfried the best song? It's really grown on me over
I
the
think I
years.
think it hits more as it hits more in as you're becoming an adult, because when this album came out, I think most of us were like early into college, or in Nick's case, late in high
Sophomore in high
school.
school.
Sophomore in high school.
Yeah.
But now that is we're kind of all exiting college and entering adulthood. I mean, that line of two kids in a swimming pool, that sort of that nuclear family thing. Obviously, the two meanings of it just being like, do I really want to live with like the sort of this nuclear family lifestyle, this thing that my parents want me to be, but also obviously the we've talked about a little bit with Frank Ocean being bi, but just sort of also sort of the queer tinge thing of like
Yeah.
you know it's simultaneously like, do I want to live this nuclear family lifestyle, but also a way of like, do I want to live this sort of straight laced lifestyle? Like, why
Yeah.
am I living my life like this? Like all this emptiness of some of the parties and all this stuff.
Yeah, it's this kind of lose lose thing where his, his otherness and his queerness has like separated him from people and ostracized him, but like you have, and then he's like, part of him wants to be a part of something, part of him wants to have the security. Like a lot of the song is him talking about like, maybe I should settle, but then he's like, maybe I'm a fool to settle for a place with some nice views. And like it's kind of this thing where he wants to be feel safe and feel a part of something, but also wants the independence to be in this. I can't relate to my peers. I'd rather live outside. I'd rather chip my pride than lose my mind out here. Like, it's just so complex in the relationship that he has, and this song has just a couple of absolute fucking stunner lyrical moments, especially once you get to the kind of spoken word rap part that comes after the fond farewell bridge, where he's speaking his nirvana was there, rare as the feathers on my dash from a phoenix, the dreaming a thought that could dream about a thought. I love the way his vocals are produced during that part, and the way that they're relating to the instrumental, and all the different shifts that this song does in just like 5 minutes, and the way that by the time you finish the song, you're like, wait, there's a lot of fucking stuff that happened in that song, but the whole time you're in it, like, it just
The end has
completely.
a really the end has like a really great line about his I think kind of his I mean he kind of touches on like I don't know being more popular and kind of having a different like persona, I guess, or like a more famous public persona in this album. He
Yeah,
says why not spend this flammable paper on this film that's my life, which is like a great line. I think like
yeah,
it kind of like makes me think of a lot of stuff for him, like just I don't know, stuff being disposable and the film that is his life, like what we're seeing as his fans, you know, and just like what he's putting out there to kind of just create his public image is just a really it really gets me thinking. It's very personal, but really, really interesting at the same time.
yeah. And then like this album has so many of those lyrics that are so like dense and meaningful, but also kind of poetic, and there's layers. Then there's also moments like the very end of this song that are just pure aching, like sincere emotion. The I'll do anything for you in the dark part is just like, oh god, it is pain,
Pain.
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 And
Ugh.
Oh
Ooh,
God.
lad. This album is that I was a little not I wasn't nervous because I knew this album was gonna fucking rock. This is one of my important, but like going back to it with the specific thought of like, all right, I'm going to talk about this. I'm going to critically reassess this album. Like, is this just something I've overhyped? Is this something I've built up in my mind? Is it just that it happened to come out at a certain period? Whatever. Did I buy into the critical? And then I come back to it and I'm like, no, no, this is the most important album that's maybe ever been written. Like, no matter how much I change or my relationship to music changes and evolves, like the power and that I have that this album has over me and my relationship with it is such a constant, because I think it's so deeply, like we're saying, like taps into something specific and personal in each one of us, that even though yes there was like a massive amount of hype around this album, but every person who engages with it I feel like has a pretty personal and unique experience with it in a way that's not usually the case for these kind of like artistically critically acclaimed works. And I just really I'm blown away by it, even more now 5 years later than I was the first time around.
You know that video of the guy smoking weed, like smoking a blunt and crying?
I love my
That's a
reefer, man. I love my reefer, man.
yeah, that's his album. That's just the
um,
constant mood of this album.
Man.
This is at its core an album about smoking weed and being sad about it. And I think that's what Frank Ocean understands better than almost any. There are so many great weed related, like the inhale inhale. There's heaven line on solo. There's a lot of good ones. A lot of very important
Mhm.
lyrics.
The thing this album I already said it, but I think it's important to just re-note is that like not only does it take it to wherever you were when this album came out, but also you're instantly able to figure out where Frank was when you're hearing some
Oh
of these
yeah,
songs. Because when I'm hearing these songs, I'm imagining him just sort of sitting outside in the night sky, the stars are shining really bright, and just laying down on the grass smoking weed and just thinking about everything, just what led my life up to this point, and is it worth continuing on can I continue this lifestyle?
Yeah.
You know, um, this one's more. This is specifically for Jackson. So when Kendall Roy, of course, has his headphones in,
Yes.
this is the song that I think he's listening to. This is the most.
Siegfried
Yes.
in your Avi on Twitter where he's very upset.
That one's Lomelda, but my headcanon for Kendall Roy, the actual Kendall Roy, is that he's listening to this album anytime he has his headphones in, and this song is the one that he probably hits him the most.
Uh,
I'm
the,
living
the
over city and taking in the homeless sometimes.
the I'm not brave line, yeah, that probably hits pretty hard. I mean, it hits pretty hard for me. Uh, I
And
think
especially Kendall, our number one boy, Kendall Roy.
yeah, the back half of this album is just really a truly ridiculous run of just emotional slugs to the chest that you have to take as a listener. Like Wait Ferrari and Siegfried being back to back on an album is just fucking preposterous. Like absolutely, how can anyone write two songs that good in sequence? And then the way that Godspeed and Future Are Free really kind of close the book on the album. Like I think really, as much as I love so the middle and the beginning, like there's so I think there's a lot of the first half of the album is kind of those nostalgic memories in a being in the way that we talk about, where this complicated thing that maybe wasn't all good sort of mutates in our vision of the past, in the way that these things become these like kind of hazy memories like Pink and White and Ivy, uh as reminiscing on the past. But then like the first half of the album feels like it's more mired in that, while the second half of the album is more of Frank stepping outside of that and sort of reflecting back on it. Kind of like Future Free reminds me of like Singing About Me, I'm Dying of Thirst, and songs like that, where he's clearly like now kind of more in the present now. He's talking about his life now. He's talking about where he is now that he's just led you through all the stuff that's happened in his past, and reflecting on the state of his life and the things that he cares about, but also kind of looking back on how his past has shaped him. And now like I really one of the moments of this album that makes me the most emotional in there are other moments in this album that make me emotional in the way that they conjure memories of myself, but like I get really emotional always listening to the first verse of Future Free and thinking about Frank in his life and all the kind of struggles he had to get to gain the financial and creative independence and the ability to execute his dream on this level. And that whole stuff where he's talking about, if I was being honest, if I could fuck 3 times a day and not skip a meal, I'm good. And that's like that's a life motto I've taken with me and will keep with me for the rest of my. But like, it's really really emotional where he's talking about like I ain't making minimum wage, mama, but I'm on, mama. I'm making 400, 600K, mama. I should be paying them. I should be paying y'all. Like, and
Hey
then
Frank,
that
I could use a check right about now, buddy.
I,
if
I
you got one for me.
we could, but the thing he says there, though, the I'm just a guy, I'm not a god, was something I was thinking about a lot on this album, because we're talking about how like this album is simultaneously this monolith, this towering work of like artistic ambition and a testament to who he is as a auteur and as a creative individual. But it's also like deconstructing the kind of myth around him. He's like, I feel like I'm a god sometimes, but I'm not. I'm just a person, and I'm letting my personhood and my vulnerability and my human fallibility into this album in a way that he kind of hadn't before. And you can really feel like the vulnerability and the sincerity in his voice when he's rapping and talking about, I'm gonna stick around, I'm gonna let my nuts, like he's joking around, but he's also really feeling it emotionally and really feeling uh the win that he's achieved here in creating this work and how empowering it is to him. And it's just really, really, really special. One of my favorite closing tracks of any album in the 2010s, easily.
And that little like sketch at the end of Future, I don't know, it's not really a sketch, but like the kind of interview he does with his little
The
brother
outro.
at Future Free, yeah, like the outro. For some reason, like that kind of like unlocks this really like emotional key deep inside me for some reason, because I think it's like very tied into the rest of this album's kind of themes about like memory and like nostalgia and all that, but this time it's like it's just so explicit about it. Like, what's your first memory? Like, what did you like to do? Like, et cetera, when you were a kid, and like that playing over that kind of never ending like weird ethereal dream loop piano by what's his name? I know he's
Buddy Ross.
Yeah, Buddy Ross. I don't know. It's just like a really perfectly complicated abstract ending, I think.
I don't know, Jackson, you might know anything about like his brother or like how old he is, but it kind of makes me think of when when that interview was even recorded. It must, I mean, I would assume
I'm
do you know, Matty?
So I'm on the Genius page right now, and it was recorded when. So here are Ryan Brew's tweets.
Oh yeah, I just found
in all caps. My interview is on the album. OMG. I was like 11. My voice was so high, and then this is worse than my yearbook picture.
Yeah, it kind of. I was starting to think about like just how old he is like now, or like, or just I guess the like what the timing of that interview must have been. I'm assuming Frank is probably older than he is.
I think
Yeah.
Frank is like 6 or 7 years older than him. It's like a sizable age gap. He's like
Then Ryan.
very
It's definitely
Right.
not 6 or 7 if he was 11 when the album.
I mean,
Those
it's possible.
these interviews are pretty clearly the timing of these interviews. It sounds like they were done probably. I want to say if it's got to be whenever like the Odd Future Store was on Fairfax, so probably like 2013, 2014, somewhere around then.
You're probably right. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. It could be like way younger too. I'm not sure, but I don't really
But
know.
yeah, there's something about like I think part of it is the quality of the recording and the messiness of it has, and the way that like people are like talking over each other the whole time. It kind of has this really like vivid quality that like you feel like it was probably recorded on VHS or something. It feels like watching a home movie, and
Yeah,
like
that's always the impression I get from it, like a home
the,
film.
the feeling of kind of looking back and like Ryan is seeing yourself at that young age and being like, oh wow, that is me, but also I feel such like a disconnect between this memory and how I feel now, and especially given that like so much of it is about what are your memories, what are your dreams, what powers do you wish that you could have. It's like really interesting to kind of reflect.
Really ties into that nostalgia kind
Yeah,
of theme that we were
absolutely.
talking about in general.
This fucking album, man. This fucking album.
Yeah.
And then the last line in the outro, how far is a light year? How far is a light year? A second, 1,000 years. Like, fuck, like that really does kind of hammer home some of those ideas that we've been dealing with, like
Space.
the space time, big stuff.
It kind of like forces you to reckon with those like really, really large, really deep questions of just about like your own life.
But in a way that never, like, this album never feels like homework, and it never feels like pretentious in the way that that kind of music that tries to do those kinds of things often feels like. It is so natural and organic in the way that the emotions unfold and are expressed so clearly that even though we're able to glean all of this extra stuff after years of analyzing the liner notes and reading the Genius page, and we have all this extra stuff we can say about it now, there's still something to like the pure shot of emotion you got the first time you received this is like really the core of it, and that thing doesn't change like that no matter how much you. I think one of the things that's most interesting to me about music, and one of the reasons why I'm like so endlessly fascinated by it, is that like with other forms of art there's so much more work that the listener has to do in order to receive and interpret and like make sense of the work. Like when you read a book, you have to read the words on the page and you have to picture in your mind what's happening, and you have to think about like how you relate to whatever the story is. Where with music is an art form that happens to you. Like it just, you can hear a song that you've never heard before, and 1 minute into it be like, this is the greatest thing I've ever heard, I'm completely transfixed by it, and you don't have to have any context for the musical. And you can get more and more information and you can try to understand it, but there's like this inherent mystery at the heart of music, where it's like,
Yeah.
no matter how much you understand about music and no matter how much you take apart the thing, there's a certain level of like, this note on a keyboard and this sonic frequency inspires an emotional response in my brain, and the point A to point B there's kind of an inherent mystery in there that I think we just don't understand. We don't understand why music is able to do what it does to us, and I think this album more than almost any other embodies that for me, because it just like washes over you, it happens to you. It's and so it's That's why it's so hard to reckon with as a work. It's so hard to discuss it like as we're trying to do right now and are all fucking over the place, because it just it hits you, and you're scrambling to try to reorient yourself and trying to use the more traditional critical ways of thinking about things. You're just going to kind of get lost in it.
It's like yeah, it's like pure experience. Whereas if you're like reading a book or if you're like watching a movie, you can be like, okay, the things like this thing happened and that makes me feel this way, or like it said this and that makes me feel this way. Whereas like when you're listening to something, it just, like you're saying, it just happens to you and you just experience it, and it just kind of is like this esoteric thing that like makes you feel a way for some reason. And so a lot of times when the albums are like super like inherently personal, it's just like naturally not really that possible to articulate why.
Yeah. What else is there to say about Blonde? What? There's
Pain.
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 But yeah, I mean, I as if anyone who read the decade list knows that I do prefer Channel Orange more to Blonde, but this discussion is it's starting to make me question that.
Yeah.
It's starting to make me question that, because this album really is so special. You know, there's so many. It's an album that simultaneously you know very clearly see the scenarios that Frank Ocean is in. It's this magical ability to be very deeply personal without spilling too many details out there. At the same time, being able to really envision yourself in these stories, these experiences, you know, and sometimes, you know, rain, glitter.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's all you need.
I think your preference for Channel Orange versus Blonde is basically whether you more appreciate kind of a I think Channel Orange is one of the greatest sort of traditional storytelling albums, in the way that each one of them is clearly about these like characters that he's created on each song. And the way I think he described it as like he wanted to write songs about worlds that were rosier than his own, and like the way that he imagines all these kind of fictional characters and is able to project himself onto them, versus the kind of stream of consciousness, personal yet mysterious method of Blonde. They're two very different approaches, and I totally get why there are still people that like loved Channel Orange and don't accept Blonde. And also I think there are people that weren't really into Channel Orange who love Blonde. And I think uh, regardless of where you stand on his discography, I think this album's importance and significance cannot be overstated. And I think we probably have tried our hardest to overstate it on this episode, but really it is, as Matty has said, it's a monolith. It's enormous.
Yeah. So I think it's a good place to wrap it up. I think we've said a lot. We're almost crossing the 2 hour point. So I think
Yeah, I think
that'll do it.
we've said enough.
Yeah.
So if you enjoyed the podcast, of course, make sure to subscribe to us on whatever platform you listen on, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Make sure to give us a follow on our Twitter. That's where you'll learn news about new podcasts and whatnot. So at Indieheads Pod. Coming up, we got 2 more retrospects for y'all. The last 2, Psychopomp and Divers, 2 very, very exciting episodes.
Those are going to be very normal episodes with not very much discussion or yelling is what's going to happen. That's my prediction on the record.
Yes. Yes.
2 very normal episodes of the podcast on the way.
Very, very normal.
Just a couple of normal people having a normal time.
So yeah, we got that, and then the Car Seat Headrest making a door less open episode, which is going to be probably out the day after this one goes up. So that's going to be a time. So yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed, and we will see you all in just a little bit. So
and remember, everyone, remember, important before we go: smoking weed makes you sluggish, lazy, stupid,
unconcerned. Sluggish, stupid.
Don't become a weed head out there if you're listening to this. Don't do it.
This is Mom. Call me. Bye.
Bye, guys.
It's your boy Soulja Boy in Dubai. Look at that camel behind me though, scratching his neck. Turn up. I got the Louis shoes dirty, goddamn.
For a couple of questions.
Hi.
So you argue in the book, Mr. Mouse goes on an adventure, that Mr. Mouse is a little bit better than the other animals in the Big Happy Barn because Mr. Mouse is kind and unique.
Stop. I never argue that Mr. Mouse is better than the other animals in the Happy Barn.
I mean, you say at the beginning, like, he's better at sharing.
Better at sharing his toys.
Okay. Well, I guess, like, isn't Mr. Mouse just a symbol for how every little boy and little girl can be, like, special?
You're asking a couple things, right? Let's break that down. I never make a value judgment about Mr. Mouse. I don't praise Mr. Mouse for winning the bake-off with a cake so yummy everyone cried. I don't praise Mr. Mouse for jumping to the moon, right? I just say he did these things. I say he did give Mayor Mimi a big hug.
But I mean, like, you would still say he's a special mouse, right?
Oh, no, I define special mouse. Really, define special mouse.
You define special mouse? You don't know
Define
what
special mouse. I don't know what a special mouse is.
You're a mouse that's, like, loyal and, like, kind,
Oh, loyal.
nice to you.
Okay, so all it takes to be a special mouse is loyalty? Someone should tell that to Mama Mouse, right?
You don't think that every little mousy boy and mousy girl has a little special something inside of them that like
shines brighter than the sun?
And, like, all you have to do
all it
is believe in
takes is
yourself?
to believe in yourself. Yeah, I've heard this argument
Like, you would
before.
say he's the cutest mouse, maybe?
Oh,
You'd say
no.
he's like-
Tell me what I argue about Mr. Mouse.
I think he said, like, he has
Big boy courage that the other mousies don't have. Tell me what happens at the jamboree.
Yeah, I mean, at the jamboree, Mr. Mouse saves the day. Yeah.
Mhm.
You know?
And how does he do that?
He does a little funny jump on the bouncy castle.
And who laughs? The whole town.
Like, do you remember the great big mouse race?
I'd like to think so. I teach a class on it at Yale.
When you opened the book up and you saw Mr. Mouse pop up out of there and give you a little kissy, that
When
did
I
it cool?
see Mr. Mouse in the pop-up book, it's fun, and of course it made me giggle. I giggled all day. It was awesome. That's neither here nor there. Here's what I'll do. I'm going to recommend a book to you. Have you read Charlotte's Web?
No, I haven't.
Read it, and I want to discuss it with you.
Alright.
Really, I do.
Alright.
I'll give you my email address. All right. Give it up for this guy. He's brave. Almost as brave as Mr. Spider.